It was in the nature of Lord Peter Wimsey to be present, without being, in any vulgar sense, there. He had come down to the little seaside town of Marloch St. Olave's on the thinnest pretext imaginable, a memorandum from his man, Bunter, suggesting that the air would agree with his lordship's throat and that the rector's wife, a second cousin twice removed of Bunter's, which in Bunter's theology of kinship was a close and binding tie, had secured for him a room in a house where one might hear oneself think. "The trouble with hearing oneself think," said Lord Peter, adjusting the collar of his coat with the fastidiousness of a man who could contemplate murder while disapproving of lint, "is that one is so often compelled to listen." Bunter, who was driving, offered the faintest of noises which, in another man, might have been agreement. In Bunter it was simply the sound a perfect servant makes to prove he is alive. Marloch Street. Olave's presented itself with that air of neatness peculiar to places that have suffered in the past from excessive romanticism. It had a church with a squat grey tower and a wind-bitten yew. It had a vicarage with thin curtains and the look of a house that knew too much about other people's sins. It had a row of shops selling postcards, black sweets, and cheaply framed views of a coastline in which the sea always appeared at its most flattering. Above all, it had a cliff path, where the wind took liberties with the living and did not trouble itself about the dead. Wimsey's lodging was in a tall, narrow house facing the churchyard. Mrs. Tollerby's. And Tollerby had the kind of face which implies that she has been consulted by Providence on matters of propriety. One might imagine that she could smell impropriety through closed doors. She received Wimsey with respectful suspicion. "You'll be wanting the front room, my lord," she said, though she pronounced lord as though it were a sort of illness one contracted in London. "It looks straight upon the church. Quiet it is, except when there's funerals." "I have no objection to funerals," said Wimsey. "Indeed, I've attended a number, but I confess to a fastidious preference that they should not be my own." Mrs. Tollerby did not smile. Smiling in her moral code was too near the brink of levity. He had barely put down his hat, placing it by instinct rather than intention, like upon a chair with the precision of a man laying down a wager, when the bell of St. Olave's began to toll. It was not the merry, practising peal of a Saturday wedding, nor the brisk chime of a Sunday summons. This was the slow, thick sound of a bell rung with restraint, as though the ringer were reluctant to admit what he had discovered. Bunter, who had moved about the room with his usual unhurried efficiency, paused. "That is the passing bell, my lord." "Really?" Wimsey lifted his eyebrows. "It seems a little early in the day for people to be passing. One expects it after luncheon at the soonest." He went to the window. The glass, imperfect with age, gave the churchyard a wavering quality, gravestones bending slightly, as though to listen, the yews stirring like black lace, and a few women clustering near the lich gate with shawls drawn up in the time-honored gesture of "something has happened and we are not surprised." The bell continued. Beneath its measured complaint, the sea made, very far off, the faintest sound of breathing. "Shall I inquire, my lord?" said Bunter. Wimsey's fingers had drifted, almost automatically, to the cigarette case in his pocket. He did not light one. "No, Bunter. Not at once. One does not rush into other people's tragedies. It is bad manners. Let us wait until they are forced to speak of it. They always are, you know. They can't help it." And as if on cue, there came a knock at the door below. Hesitant, then repeated with an urgency that tried to remain civil. Mrs. Tollerby's voice rose, sharp with offence. "What is it now? Oh, Mr. Vane. Well, you can't come in here with muddy boots. I'm not on my stair." A man's voice, breathless, apologetic, and strained. "Mrs. Tollerby, I beg your pardon, but Lord Peter Wimsey, he's here, isn't he?" Wimsey turned from the window with that mild look of interest a cat assumes when a mouse is obliging enough to introduce itself. A moment later, the man appeared in the doorway of the room above, hat in hand, cheeks reddened by wind and something more private. He was in clerical dress, though not in the solid, settled manner of a man at peace in his parish. Rather, he looked as though his collar were a restraint and his coat a costume. His hair was untidy in the way of people who have run their hands through it too often while thinking. "Lord Peter," he said, and swallowed. "I am the Reverend Stephen Vane, vicar of St. Olave's." Whimsy inclined his head courteously. "Delighted, Mr. Vane, or at any rate, interested. Won't you sit down? You look as though you have been pursued by the wrath of God, which I find is sometimes nothing more than the wrath of Mrs. Tollaby in a different dress." The clergyman did not sit. He stood with his back half to the door, as though fearful that, if he relaxed, the room might fill with whatever he had just left outside. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, "but there's been something in the church." In the church? Whimsy's tone held no alarm, only that polite attention which implies that churches, like theatres, are places where one expects drama, but not necessarily death. Vane nodded, once quickly, like a man agreeing with a verdict he cannot bear. "He came in early, before matins. He asked to see me. He said it was urgent. I told him I would be in the vestry in 10 minutes. He stopped, and something in his expression suggested that he had reached a point in the telling where memory was no longer a sequence, but a blow. Whimsy waited. It was one of his more disconcerting habits. He could wait without any visible impatience, like a man who knew that the truth, like a badly wrapped parcel, will always come apart if one gives it time. Vane's lips moved before sound came. He went into the confessional. Now, Marlock Street Olaves did not, on the whole, encourage confessionals. St. Olave's, though old, was not ostentatiously Anglo-Catholic. Its piety ran to drafts, hymn books, and practical charity, and did not much approve of boxes with curtains. But there was a confessional, an antique contrivance left behind by a former incumbent who had flirted with Rome as one might flirt with gout, romantically and without calculation, Whimsy said lightly. A confessional. How very medieval of him. The clergyman's eyes fastened on Whimsy's face with sudden, hungry appeal. "My lord, when I went in, he was dead." A silence fell. Not the dramatic silence of melodrama. Rather the sort of silence that drops into a room when an ordinary word has been used to name an extraordinary thing. Bunter, who had made himself unobtrusive by instinct, stepped forward. "Shall I send for the police, my lord?" "The police are probably already coming," said Whimsy. "In places like this, death travels faster than telegrams." Vane made a small movement of despair. "They will, yes, but Lord Peter, he left a note." "For you?" "For me?" Whimsy's eyebrows rose again, this time with genuine surprise. "How remarkably considerate of him. I don't even know the gentleman." "You do," said Vane, and his voice cracked on the words. "At least, your name was in his mouth. He said he had only a few minutes and that it was too late." Whimsy's fingers, which had been toying with the edge of his cuff, stilled. "Did he say anything else?" Vane fumbled in his pocket and produced an envelope. Cheap paper, badly sealed. The sort of thing one buys from a village shop with stamps and bootlaces. Across the front, in a cramped, slanting hand, was written, "Lord Peter Whimsy. If he is in Marlock, find him at once." Whimsy took the envelope, turning it over with the care one gives to a small and potentially venomous creature. "Was it found on him?" "In the confessional," whispered Vane, "on the ledge. As though he had placed it there deliberately. As though—" He broke off. "As though he had come to confess," supplied Whimsy very gently. "And decided that absolution was an inadequate luxury." Vane's hands opened and closed as though he were trying to grasp something invisible. I did not. He did not confess to me. He was waiting. I thought he was praying. I thought, oh God. Whimsy nodded. Quite. One always thinks the thing that will hurt one least. He slipped a finger under the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. The writing was hurried, uneven, and, Whimsy noticed, blotted in places, as if the pen had hesitated or the hand had trembled. He did not read it at once. He held it and looked at Vane. You have not read it, I hope. Vane stared. No. It was not addressed to me. Excellent, said Whimsy. You are either remarkably honest, Mr. Vane, or you are a clergyman. Either quality will do. He unfolded the paper, and the note contained only a few lines. My lord, if you are in Marlock, come to St. Olave's at once. It is too late for me, but not, perhaps, not for the rest. I have made a final confession, and it will not be believed. The bell will ring, the sea will be quiet. Do not trust the clock. A.G. Whimsy read it twice. The second time his face altered very slightly, not into alarm, but into that curious, distant attentiveness which in him often preceded amusement, and just as often preceded catastrophe. Do not trust the clock, he repeated softly. How charmingly melodramatic, and signed a G, which is either the beginning of a name or the end of a life. Vane leaned forward. Who is he? Do you know him? A G? Whimsy refolded the note with meticulous care and slipped it into his breast pocket. I cannot say that I do, he said, but it appears, in Mr. Vane, that he knows me, or thinks he does. That is always a disagreeable sensation. Outside, the bell of St. Olave's continued to toll, steady and inexorable. Whimsy reached for his hat again. Come along, he said. Let us go and look at your confessional. I have always had a curiosity about the private sins of others, purely from an anthropological standpoint, you understand? Vane drew a breath as if bracing himself. My lord, the body. There is something... Yes? Whimsy's tone remained light, but his eyes sharpened. The clergyman's voice dropped to a whisper, and in it there was, for the first time, the faintest hint of that Gothic chill which respectable English people prefer to avoid by drawing the curtains early. It looks, said Vane, as though he died listening. Whimsy paused on the threshold, the one-gloved hand on the banister. Listening, he repeated. To what? Vane's eyes flicked unwillingly toward the churchyard window, where the tower stood like a clenched fist against the grey sky. To the other side, he said. To the other side of the confessional. Whimsy's mouth curved, almost imperceptibly, as though some private and not altogether pleasant thought had amused him. My dear Mr. Vane, he said, in my experience the other side is always where the trouble is. And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy went down the stairs, into the quiet town, the orderly church, the murmuring of women at the gate, and the first faint, salt-sweet odor of a mystery that had already begun to rot at the edges. The path to St. Olave's ran past the churchyard wall, where the stones leaned at odd angles, and like elderly parishioners craning to overhear scandal. Whimsy walked with his hands in his pockets and the air of a man taking the measure of a tune. Bunter followed at the precise distance which suggested that if his lordship were to fall suddenly into an open grave, Bunter would be there to hand him a handkerchief before inquiring whether he would care to be pulled out. Near the lich gate, a small group of women parted reluctantly, as though the mere act of making way might be construed as taking sides. Their faces bore that expression of proprietary grief which country towns wear when death, particularly a death not strictly sanctioned by Providence, occurs in public. One of them, in a bonnet that had seen better decades, was saying in a high, confidential voice, "And I said to Mrs. Cramp, I said, mark me, it'll end bad. It will..." Before another hushed her, because the vicar was approaching and vicars, even in an emergency, were expected to remain ignorant of female prophecy. Inspector Parker would have known how to deal with them. A courteous nod, a soothing platitude, and an inward resolution to obtain their statements later by the efficient application of authority. Whimsy, who possessed no authority and seldom applied efficiency, lifted his hat with elaborate politeness. "Good morning," he said. "Deplorable weather for this sort of thing, isn't it? Though perhaps it saves on flowers." They stared at him, uncertain whether he was mocking them or sympathizing, and because English women dislike both equally, they retreated into offended silence. Whimsy passed on, mildly pleased. "Your parishioners are in excellent training," he observed to Vane. "One could hang a man in the market square, and they would still consider it bad form to raise their voices." Vane made no reply. His face, pale and windswept, had the strained vacancy of a man who has been asked to conduct a service for which he has mislaid the words. Inside the church, the air changed. The salt tang of the sea gave way to stone, damp wood, and that faint human residue. Old hymn books, old wool, old prayers. The bell's sound was muffled now, as though it were coming from inside one's own head. The nave was empty, save for one boy in a cassock, hovering near the font with the anxious look of a creature uncertain whether he ought to run away or be useful. He stared at Whimsy and Bunter with a fascinated dread of youth confronted by a gentleman in spats. "That'll be Edwin," murmured Vane, and as though naming him might anchor reality. "Edwin Pike. He was helping me with the candles." Whimsy's gaze flickered over the boy, noting the dirt beneath the nails, the freckled nose, the eyes too bright with excitement. "Morning, Edwin," he said. "You look like a cherub who's seen something he can't spell." Edwin swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Don't worry," said Whimsy. "Most of us do, sooner or later." Vane led the way down the side aisle toward the little chapel where the confessional had been placed, an intrusion of dark wood and curtains in an otherwise sober Protestant corner. It looked ridiculous and vaguely indecent, like a theatrical prop forgotten after a melodrama. Its door stood half ajar. From within came a faint, medicinal smell, lavender water and something metallic. Whimsy paused a moment before entering, and his eyes traveled, she apparently idly, along the flagged floor. "Curious," he murmured. "These stones are uneven. See the way the light catches? Someone's been dragging something heavy across them lately, or—" He glanced at the base of a nearby pillar where the dust had been scuffed. "Wearing boots that don't lift their feet?" Bunter, who had bent as though to adjust his cuff, said quietly, "There is grit, my lord. Recent. From the cliff path, I should think." "Ah," said Whimsy. "So our penitent has been walking." Vane, already white, flinched. I didn't notice." "Of course not," said Whimsy kindly. "It's never the vicar's business to notice grit. That's for the sexton or the devil." He stepped inside. The confessional was narrow, close, and absurdly intimate. A small ledge ran along one side, a hinged screen with a lattice separated the compartments, and a curtain hung limp as a tongue that had lost interest in speech. In the priest's side, a prayer card lay face down. In the penitent's side, a man sat crumpled, as though he had tried to fold himself into prayer and failed. He was middle-aged, well-built, and dressed with care that had been defeated by haste. Good tweed coat, collar slightly awry, one glove still on, the other clenched in his lap. His head lolled a little, chin tilted toward the lattice, so that the left side of his face showed plainly. The eyes were half open, fixed upon the screen with an expression that was not peace nor terror, but a strained, listening patience, as though he had been waiting for someone on the other side to speak, and had died in the act of attending. There was, at first glance, no violence, no blood theatrically displayed, no dagger, no overturned furniture, only the grotesque incongruity of death seated neatly behind curtains, like an embarrassing secret. Whimsy did not touch the body. He merely stood, head slightly on one side, like a man considering a line of verse. "Do you know him?" he asked. Vane's voice came thinly. "Yes, that is Mr. Ambrose Grail. He lives at Grail House, above the cliffs." "A G," said Whimsy softly. "So, and what, pray, was Mr. Grail doing confessing in your curious little box? At what time did you say?" Vane blinked. "Just after 8. Before matins. I'd only stepped away. 10 minutes. Whimsy's eyes moved to the small clock on the chapel wall, a modest thing with a white face and black Roman numerals, ticking with cheerful insistence. 10 minutes, he repeated, and smiled faintly. Yes, everybody's 10 minutes, and a town can commit a multitude of sins in 10 minutes, provided it keeps its voice down. Then he leaned, ever so slightly, toward the lattice. Not to peer through, it was too dark, but to listen. And after a moment, Bunter saw, with a small inward start, that Whimsy was smiling again, that detached, private smile he wore when a puzzle piece had pricked his finger. "Mr. Vane," said Whimsy, "who was on the other side of this confessional when Mr. Grail came in?" Parker would have liked to arrive first. He did not, of course. Providence has always favored theatrics over tidiness, and Providence, in the form of a bell-ringer's wife, had already favored half the high street with the news before the constabulary's bicycle had cleared the corner. My Superintendent Lubbock arrived with 2 constables and the air of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a sensible breakfast by somebody else's foolishness. He was heavy-set, red about the nose, and bore a mustache, which seemed less a feature than an opinion. Behind him came Dr. Haskett, Marlock's general practitioner, carrying a small leather bag and wearing the expression of one who has been called upon, once again, to pronounce common sense over the ruins of human behavior. When Lubbock caught sight of Whimsy, his eyes narrowed, not with hostility, but with suspicion of expense. "His lordship," he said, as though tasting an unfamiliar sauce. "I didn't know we'd got the aristocracy in the parish." "I drift in with the sea fret," said Whimsy pleasantly. "Salt air, you know. It keeps one from entirely decomposing." Lubbock's gaze travelled, unwillingly, to the confessional. "Vicar says he found him sitting there like a blasted waxwork." "Vicar says many things," murmured Whimsy, and then, raising his voice with that courteous innocence which invariably suggested he was being impertinent, "Good morning, Superintendent. I hope I'm not in the way." "You are in the church," said Lubbock grimly, which is not the same thing. Dr. Haskett squeezed past, bending his head as though the low wooden roof of the confessional might strike him with contagion. He knelt with professional economy, took the man's wrist, looked at the eyes, the lips, the angle of the head. "Dead," he said shortly. "An hour or so, perhaps. No obvious wound, no smell of gas, no sign of a seizure." He shifted his fingers to the throat, and his brows knitting. Whimsy, standing in the doorway with the attentive detachment of an onlooker at a lecture, said mildly, Is always an encouraging sound from a doctor." Haskett grunted and, with a motion half reluctant and half resigned, loosened the victim's collar. Something glinted briefly and vanished again as Haskett's thumb moved. "Well," he said at last, and sat back on his heels. "That's your answer, I expect." Lubbock leaned in, impatient. "What is it?" "A puncture," said Haskett. "Here, just under the left ear. Tiny. Might be taken for an insect bite if you didn't know what you were looking for." Whimsy's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "A needle," he said softly. "Possibly," said Haskett. "Or a very fine blade. And there's a slight, only slight discoloration. I can't swear to poison without examination, but yes, that's the sort of mark you get when somebody's been administered something they oughtn't." Lubbock drew a breath through his teeth. "In church," he muttered. "Christ almighty." "Not always in attendance," said Whimsy, almost apologetically. "Even when invited." The superintendent turned on Vane. "Who else was in here this morning?" Vane's mouth worked. No one. At least not that I saw. Edwin was about, helping with the candles. The boy, pressed against the chapel rail, turned scarlet. I didn't do nothing, he burst out. I never even went in that thing. Nobody said you did, said Whimsy with amiable quickness. Though if you mean you did not go into the confessional, you might consider saying so. That thing sounds prejudiced. Edwin glared at him, and uncertain whether he was being defended or mocked, and decided upon both. Lubbock said heavily, We'll have order. Vicar, you said he asked to see you. Yes. Why? I don't know. He seemed disturbed. He said he had something to say, something he must get off his conscience. Lubbock snorted. Conscience. Old Grail's conscience. That'll be the day. Superintendent, said Whimsy, you appear to have formed an opinion of the deceased. Lubbock shrugged, but his mustache bristled. Grail House employs half the village and underpays the lot. He sued Mrs. Nutter's boy for pinching a rabbit. He turned old Mr. Swafield off his cottage for being behind with the rent when his wife was dying. If he had a conscience, he kept it in a drawer and forgot where. That is a great deal of character assassination for a man who has only just been assassinated, said Whimsy. But it has the virtue of making him unpopular, which is always useful for murder. Haskett stood up, wiping his hands on a handkerchief with fussy distaste. If you want my medical opinion, Superintendent, I'd say he was killed quickly. There's no struggle. He's posed. See? His head's turned toward the grill, like he was attending. Whoever did it was close enough to prick him without his moving. Lubbock peered. Could have been done through the lattice. Whimsy leaned in, delicately, and examined the little holes, each no wider than a pea, set in a pattern. He did not touch the wood. He merely looked as if he could coax it to confess by observation. Possibly, he said. No, but it would require a very steady hand and an instrument long enough to reach the neck at that angle. Also, his gaze dropped to the curtain. One would have to open this a little, unless one is blessed with an arm like a fishing rod. Bunter, quietly behind him, murmured, The curtain edge is frayed, my lord. Recently. Whimsy nodded, as though Bunter had commented on the weather. And here, Whimsy added, a trace of something, chalk, flour, on the hem. That is curious in a confessional. Lubbock's patience snapped. What's curious is you poking about in it. This is police business, Lord. Whimsy, supplied Whimsy. You were about to say that this is police business, and you are perfectly right. But since the deceased has written to me, and since he appears to have chosen this particular theater for his finale, I think it may also be, if not my business, at least my entertainment. Lubbock's eyes narrowed. He wrote to you? Vane flinched again. Yes. He left a note. Whimsy took it from his pocket and, with an air of reluctant generosity, held it out. Lubbock read, moving his lips on "Do not trust the clock," and looked up sharply at the little chapel clock ticking away with brisk innocence. What clock? He demanded. Whimsy smiled as though at a private joke. That, he said, is precisely the right question. And what's this about a confession? Lubbock said. Whimsy's gaze moved not to the dead man, but to the other side of the confessional, the priest's compartment, small and dark and, at the moment, empty. There is a peculiarity about confessionals, he said lightly. They are designed for voices to travel without faces. One may speak to a man and never see him. One may listen to a voice and attach to it any soul one pleases. And one may, his tone altered, the humor thinning, also be listened to. Haskett shifted uneasily. Vane went paler still. Lubbock stared at the lattice, then at the curtain, then at Edwin, who edged farther away as though the wood might bite. You mean someone was in the other side? He said. Whimsy's eyes were steady. I mean, he replied, that Mr. Ambrose Grail died as though he were waiting for a voice. And I should like to know whose voice he expected. and whether he heard it. Lubbock sealed off the chapel with a length of tape that looked absurdly modern against the ancient stone, and stationed a constable at the entrance with the stern instruction that nobody, not even the Almighty, was to pass without permission. This, if nothing else, lent the occasion a certain dignity. The constable, a young man with a moustache scarcely more than a rumour, planted his boots as though expecting the corpse to make a second attempt at leaving. Whimsy, having been politely informed that he was not to touch nothing, behaved with admirable docility by touching nothing at all, save, perhaps, the nerves of everyone within reach. "Now then," said Lubbock, producing a notebook and adopting the heavy briskness of a man who finds questions indecent. "We'll have it plain. Vicar, you say Grail came in. What did he say to you?" Vane's hands made a helpless gesture, palms upward, an ecclesiastical surrender. "He said, 'Only, I must speak to you. It's too late.' I asked him what was the matter. He said he could not say it in the open. He asked if the confessional was usable." Lubbock snorted. "And you let him?" Yes. I thought, if a man's conscience, repeated Lubbock, with the same tone he might have used for cholera. "Go on." Vane swallowed. "I told him I would come in 10 minutes. I had to speak to Mrs. Cramp about the flowers for Sunday, and Edwin was lighting the candles, and there was a message from the schoolmaster about the choir." "Ah," said Whimsy softly. "The church at work, flowers, candles, choir, and death tucked in among them like a misprint." Lubbock glared. "Not helpful." "No," agreed Whimsy pleasantly, "but accurate." Haskett, who had been making notes of his own on a scrap of paper with the impatience of a man who dislikes mystery in other people's bodies, said abruptly, "Vicar, when you found him, did you touch him? No, move him?" Vane shook his head violently. "No. I called Edwin. Then I rang for Mrs. Tollaby because she's always about, and I thought someone must fetch the police." From the nave came Mrs. Tollaby's voice, muffled but penetrating like a kettle heard through a door. "And I said to Mr. Pike, I said, 'You go straight to Superintendent Lubbock and you tell him, and no detours, mind. Because young men nowadays—'" Lubbock coughed as though to clear his throat of Mrs. Tollaby's opinions and returned to his notebook. "Edwin Pike, you were here." The boy, dragged forward by the mere mention of his name, stood with his hands behind his back in the posture of the eternally accused. "Yes, sir." "What time did Grail come in?" Edwin's eyes flicked to the chapel clock on the wall, and then away again quickly, as though it had become untrustworthy by association. "Just after 8, he said. "I'd only just finished the south candlesticks. He came in through the porch, quick-like, and he looked at me as if, I don't know, as if I was in the way." "Did he speak to you?" "No, sir, only," he said, "Where's the vicar?" And I said, "In the vestry," and then he went down here. "And did anyone else come in after him?" demanded Lubbock. Edwin hesitated. Only a fraction, but enough. Whimsy's head tilted, as though listening for the hesitation rather than the answer. I don't think so." Lubbock pounced. "Don't think? Either they did or they didn't." Edwin's ears reddened. "There was Mrs. Cramp," he blurted. "But she always comes in. She's the cleaner. She come in with her bucket." Vane looked startled. "Mrs. Cramp? At that hour?" Edwin nodded miserably. "She said she'd forgot the hassocks last night, and the vicar don't like 'em smelling musty." "Which is true," said Vane faintly, as though clinging to any solid fact. Whimsy said mildly, "And did Mrs. Cramp come down to the chapel?" Edwin shook his head. "No, sir. She stayed by the pews, swishing about. She's got a limp, say, so you'd hear her if she came." Haskett looked up sharply. "A limp?" "Yes, sir. Her leg's bad." Whimsy's eyes moved, almost lazily, to the flagged floor outside the chapel. Those scuffed marks, the grit, the drag. One could almost see, in imagination, The passage of a bucket, a boot that did not lift, a determined little journey. Lubbock scribbled, "We'll speak to Mrs. Cramp in a bit. Now, Vicar, you say you were in the vestry. Anyone see you there?" Vane's mouth tightened. "No. I was alone." "Convenient," said Lubbock bluntly. Vane flinched as though struck, and Whimsy's voice, when he spoke, had acquired that gentle edge which meant he was being kind in the manner of a man who could afford cruelty. "Superintendent," he said, "it is possible to be alone without being guilty, though I admit the world does not always encourage one to believe it." Lubbock ignored him and turned to the chapel clock again, as though it had offended him personally. "And this business about not trusting the clock, what clock is that meant to be?" Whimsy wandered a step nearer the wall, peering with great interest at the clock's face. "It is a very respectable clock," he said. "Black Roman numerals, no frivolous embellishments. If one were a clock, one would be proud to be this one." "For God's sake, Whimsy," Lubbock began, as Whimsy lifted a hand, almost apologetically. "Observe," he said. "It is ticking, but listen." They did listen then, against their will. The tick was crisp, but there was something faintly irregular about it, an occasional little stumble, like a man who catches his toe on the edge of a carpet and recovers with dignity. Haskett said impatiently, "It's running uneven." "Just so," said Whimsy. "And now, Superintendent, kindly tell me, what time does it show?" Lubbock glanced. 8:23. "And your watch?" said Whimsy. Lubbock, frowning, pulled out his watch. 8:19. "And yours, Doctor?" Haskett looked. 8:20. Whimsy turned, smiling faintly. "And mine," he said, producing a slender gold watch, "says 8:21. A charming little chorus of disagreement. Now, if we cannot trust the clock, perhaps we cannot trust the times given by those who looked at it." Vane's face had gone grey. "You mean matins? Grail? 10 minutes?" "I mean," said Whimsy softly, "that the first thing a murderer does, if he is clever enough, is not to kill a man. It is to kill the certainty of when." There was a movement at the chapel entrance. The young constable, rigid with importance, had allowed somebody to approach, and now stood uncertain whether to bar her or salute her. The intruder was Mrs. Cramp. She was a small woman, wrapped in a shawl with hands reddened by soap and cold. One boot heel was worn down, and when she shifted her weight, it became clear that Edwin had not lied. Her right leg did not bear her properly. She carried a bucket from which came the sour, clean smell of carbolic and the faint metallic tang of water. Well, she stopped dead when she saw the men in the tape, and her eyes flew to the confessional with that peculiar mixture of fear and fascination which the respectable poor reserve for other people's tragedies. "What's all this?" she demanded, in a voice that attempted indignation and failed into panic. "I ain't done nothing. I only come in to do my work." Whimsy, watching her with an almost affectionate interest, said, "Mrs. Cramp, I believe. Tell me, when you came in with your bucket this morning, did you happen to notice whether the confessional curtain was open or shut?" Mrs. Cramp's eyes darted, not to the men, but to the little dark structure itself, as though she half expected it to answer for her. She tightened her grip on the bucket handle. The metal creaked faintly, a thin, complaining sound like the chapel clock's occasional stumble. "So open," she said at last, with a sort of defiant misery. "A bit open, like somebody'd been in and come out quick." Whimsy, who had the maddening habit of looking as though he were conversing about something charming and domestic, nodded as if curtains were his usual passion. "A bit open," he repeated. "Not neatly drawn, not snugly closed, just carelessly ajar." "I didn't touch it," said Mrs. Cramp at once. "I don't hold with it, not for our church. Boxes and whispering, it's popish, and no good comes of folk shutting themselves up in little places." "No good," said Whimsy, "certainly came of it for Mr. Grail." Mrs. Cramp's mouth tightened. "He come in a trembling, he did. Not like him. He's always been a man as could look through you and not see you. But this morning—" She stopped, swallowing. "I seen him go down the aisle as if the stones was trying to trip him." Lubbock snapped. "Answer the question. You say the curtain was open. When was this?" Mrs. Cramp blinked at him, affronted by the abruptness, then fumbled for obedience. "After 8, she said. "I can't say exact because—" And here her eyes flicked again, unwillingly, toward the chapel clock. "Because that clock's a liar half the time. Always has been. It loses and gains, and Mr. Vane's been meaning to have it seen to since Michaelmas." Whimsy's head lifted a fraction. "Since Michaelmas," he murmured, as if filing the date away among the Dead Sea Scrolls. "How obliging of the clock to choose this morning to be, what shall we say, particularly imaginative." Lubbock's pencil scratched. "You came in. You saw Grail. You saw the curtain. Did you see anybody else?" Mrs. Cramp hesitated. Not the honest hesitation of poor memory, but the cautious one of a person deciding whether truth is safe. Edwin blurted, eager to be useful now that his own peril seemed to have shifted to another pair of shoulders. "She come in with her bucket. I told him." Mrs. Cramp shot him a look that might have curdled milk. "I know you did," she said. "You've got a tongue like a bell rope, Edwin Pike." Whimsy's eyes softened, amused. "Apropos of bell ropes, who rang the passing bell?" he asked. "Not you, surely, Mrs. Cramp. One cannot scrub a knave and toll doom simultaneously, though I admit women have been known to attempt it." Mrs. Cramp's face worked. "That'd be Mr. Swaffield," she said. "Old Mr. Swaffield. He does the bell when he's able." "Swaffield," repeated Whimsy lightly. "The one turned out of his cottage?" Mrs. Cramp's mouth set in a line. "Aye. Him. But don't you go putting that on him neither. He wouldn't hurt a fly. He'd sooner starve than steal a crust." "A fly?" said Whimsy. "No. One does not administer poison to a fly. One simply swats it. Our murderer," and he spoke the word as calmly as he might have said gardener, "had finesse." Lubbock made an impatient noise. "Will you stop talking in riddles and let the woman answer? Mrs. Cramp, did you see anyone go into the chapel after Mr. Grail?" Mrs. Cramp's gaze slid away. Her lame legs shifted, and the worn heels scuffed the stone with that unmistakable dragging sound. Bunter's eyes, as quiet as ever, rested on her boots with the impersonal attention of a man accustomed to noticing mud. "No," she said at last. "I didn't see no one." Whimsy leaned very slightly forward. "And did you hear anyone?" he asked, softly. She started. The question was aimed like a pin, small, precise, and unpleasantly intimate. "Here." "In a church," said Whimsy, "one hears all sorts of things one is not meant to hear. A cough, a footstep, a prayer one wishes the Almighty hadn't been asked to entertain. A voice, perhaps." Mrs. Cramp's lips parted. She looked suddenly frightened, less of the police than of memory itself. "I heard," she began, and stopped. Lubbock pounced. "What did you hear?" Mrs. Cramp's eyes went to the lattice of the confessional as though it might accuse her of eavesdropping. "I heard talking," she whispered, "not loud. Like when folk think they're hid. A man's voice, low, and another." Vane, who had been standing rigidly, said hoarsely, "Another man's voice." Mrs. Cramp shook her head quickly. "No, not a man. A woman, soft-like. Like a lady, you know. Proper." A faint change passed over Whimsy's face. It was not triumph. He never gave other people the satisfaction of seeing him triumph, but a deepening of attention, as though a familiar chord had been struck somewhere in the dark. "A lady's voice," he repeated. "In the confessional." Mrs. Cramp hugged her bucket as though it were protection. "I didn't listen," she insisted with the desperate virtue of the eavesdropper. "I was by the pews. I was wiping the end, where the choir boys always get it sticky, and I heard it through. Only bits. The man said something like, You promised." And the lady said, "Hush." "Hush," echoed Whimsy, almost to himself. "An excellent word for murder." Lubbock's face had gone a shade darker. You're sure it was a woman?" "As sure as I am I've got a bad leg," said Mrs. Cramp, and stamped clumsily so that her heel scraped. Whimsy's eyes flicked to the scrape. "And did you," he said, "by any chance, hear the clock strike?" The question, absurd on its face, hit the air like a stone dropped into a well. Mrs. Cramp stared at him, and for the first time her expression held something like dawning comprehension, an unwilling sense that the silly domestic objects of her day were being made to testify. "I did," she said slowly. "It struck once. Wrong. It struck the quarter, and then, after it struck again, like it couldn't make up its mind." Whimsy's voice was mild, almost lazy. "Like a liar correcting himself," he said, "or like someone making it do so." Lubbock snapped his notebook shut as if closing a trap. "Right," he said. "Yes, we'll have names. What lady would be in this church at that hour? Vicar, who are your ladies?" Vane blinked, genuinely bewildered by the phrase. "My ladies? There is Mrs. Tollaby, of course, and Mrs. Cramp and Mrs. Nutter." Lubbock cut across him. "A lady, Vicar, not a cleaner, not a lodging-house keeper. A lady." Vane's throat bobbed. "There is. Miss Grayle," he said reluctantly. "Mr. Grayle's sister. She comes sometimes. She plays the harmonium on Sundays when the organ wheezes." Whimsy's eyes lifted to the chapel clock again. It ticked on, smug and steady, like a witness determined to appear respectable. "Miss Grayle," Whimsy repeated. "A lady voice, a confessional, a note to me, and a clock that cannot be trusted." He put on his gloves with slow deliberation, drawing the kid down each finger as though preparing not for violence, but for a social call. "Superintendent," he said, "you have your obvious suspect, and I congratulate you. But before you arrest a lady for whispering in church, may I ask one small, irrelevant question?" Lubbock scowled. "What now?" Whimsy's gaze went past the superintendent, through the chapel, to the dimness of the nave and the west door beyond. "Why?" he asked gently. "Does a confessional in a Protestant seaside church smell faintly of lavender water and something metallic, when nobody admits to going near it?" Grayle House, it transpired, sat above the town like a well-bred rebuke, stone-faced, shuttered, and presented to the cliff edge with that air of permanent disapproval which certain families cultivate as a substitute for affection, that one did not so much approach it as submit to it. The road ran up between gorse and stunted hawthorn, the sea always on the left, whitening itself against black rocks with the steady, indifferent persistence of time. Honest time, at least, unconnected with chapel clocks. Lubbock, having at last permitted that Whimsy might be tolerated as an unofficial nuisance, marched ahead with 2 constables. Vane came too, though nobody had invited him. He had the look of a man who feels personally responsible for all deaths occurring within reach of his theology. Bunter followed Whimsy with that unobtrusive gravity which suggested that, if asked, he could have carried the corpse, the confessional, and the clock under one arm. Whimsy, walking with his head slightly bent against the wind, said to nobody in particular, "Lavender water, a domestic scent. They're respectable. One associates it with linen cupboards and maiden aunts. Yet there is something else. Metallic. Like pennies on the tongue. Like blood," said Haskett bluntly, catching up, his medical bag bumping his thigh. He had insisted on accompanying them, partly from professional interest and partly because it was, for a small-town doctor, the most entertainment available before luncheon. "Not much of it," said Whimsy. "Not enough for Mrs. Cramp to remark upon, but enough for a man with his head shut in a box to notice, perhaps." Haskett gave him a sidelong look. "You're thinking of something like cyanide, or prussic acid." "I'm thinking," said Whimsy, "of the fact that very few poisons smell of lavender, and very few ladies carry hypodermic needles to church." They had reached the gates now, iron, flaking paint, and a bell pull that nobody used. Lubbock rang anyway with the air of a man challenging the house to deny him. After a time, a woman opened the door. Middle-aged, severe, dressed in black with a white collar that made her look like a governess who had never forgiven the world for being childish. Her eyes moved over the party with calm distaste and stopped on Whimsy with the faintest flicker of recognition, either of his face or of his class, or of the kind of trouble that always seems to come with well-cut coats. "Yes?" she said. It was not in her mouth a question, it was a barrier. "Police," said Lubbock. "Superintendent Lubbock, we need to speak to Miss Grayle." The woman did not step aside. "Miss Grayle is not well," she said, "and if this is about my brother—" "It is," said Lubbock shortly. "He's dead." If she felt anything, since it did not appear in her face, only her hand tightened on the door edge until the knuckles paled. "I see," she said, and for the first time her voice altered, flattening, becoming more correct. "Then you had better come in." They entered a hall smelling faintly of beeswax and old books. Somewhere a clock ticked, slow, sonorous, and confident. Whimsy's eyes lifted at once, and he smiled very slightly, as though greeted by an honest friend after an unpleasant encounter. "Ah," he murmured, "a clock that knows its business." The woman, evidently the housekeeper, heard him and stiffened. "That is Mr. Grayle's grandfather clock," she said. "It has kept time in this house for 80 years. "Then," said Whimsy, "it has outlived several moral reputations. Admirable." Lubbock followed her into a drawing room that had been arranged decades ago, for the comfort of people who did not enjoy comfort. The chairs were stiff, the curtains heavy, the carpet bore a pattern of twisting leaves that seemed to have been designed to conceal stains. On the mantelpiece stood a clock of yet another kind, small, ornate, and stopped at 12 minutes past 7. Whimsy paused before it as though struck by an aesthetic consideration. "Broken?" he asked. The housekeeper's lips compressed. "It was not broken yesterday," Haskett said sharply. "When was it last wound?" "I wind it," she said. "Every evening." "And yesterday?" Haskett pressed. "I did," she repeated. "At 9. Whimsy's gaze remained on the frozen hands. 12 minutes past 7, he said. "A charmingly arbitrary death for a timepiece." Lubbock, impatient with clocks and charm, said, "Where is Miss Grayle?" The housekeeper hesitated a fraction of a second too long. "In the morning room," she said at last. "She has not left it since she heard the bell." Vane, who had been staring about him with that guilty curiosity Vickers reserved for other people's wealth, flinched at the mention of the bell. "The bell rang at," he began, and stopped because nobody wanted to be trapped by an hour again. They crossed into a smaller room facing the sea. The windows were shut, but the sound of the waves came through anyway, like breath drawn between teeth. A woman sat at a writing table. She was not young, but she had preserved, with a kind of stubborn pride, the outline of beauty. A long throat, fine hands, hair arranged with care. Her dress was dark blue with a brooch at the collar, an amethyst set in silver. She looked up as they entered. "Superintendent," she said quietly, and then her eyes moved past him and stopped on Whimsy with that odd steadiness which suggested she had seen his sort before, in other rooms, under other circumstances. "Lord Peter?" Whimsy bowed. "Miss Grayle, I'm sorry to intrude upon your grief. Your brother appears to have arranged for intrusions." Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "My brother," she said, "arranged for nothing except inconvenience. He had a talent for it." Lubbock cleared his throat. "We have reason to believe you were at St. Olave's this morning." A pause. The sea breathed. The grandfather clock in the hall struck a single note, deep, dignified, accurate. Miss Grayle's gaze did not flicker. "I was," she said. "I went in to pray." "At 8?" demanded Lubbock. "Say at what your chapel clock would like to call 8, said Whimsy gently, and watched her face. Her eyes narrowed a fraction. "I went early," she said. "I was restless." Lubbock said. A woman was heard speaking in the confessional. Miss Grayle's hands moved, just slightly, toward her brooch, as if to steady it. "The confessional," she said, with perfectly performed surprise. "In that absurd box? I've never used it." Whimsy's tone remained airy. "No, of course not. It is a ridiculous thing. One cannot imagine a lady of your intelligence whispering behind curtains." Her eyes met his, cold, grey-blue, with a fatigue that might have been sorrow or something harder. "You are very kind," she said. "But I do not see why you are here, Lord Peter. This is a matter for the police." "Ordinarily," said Whimsy. "I should agree. But your brother wrote to me. He said it was too late for him. He also said," and here he watched her as one watches a needle approach skin, "do not trust the clock." For the first time, something real moved under Miss Grayle's composure. A flicker of irritation, quickly masked, or fear, quickly disciplined. "The clock," she repeated. "My brother was always fanciful." "Fanciful men rarely go to confession," said Whimsy. "They prefer theatre. And if you will forgive me, Miss Grayle, your brother's death has a theatricality of its own. A man seated as though listening, killed with something small and precise, while a lady's voice says, 'Hush.'" Lubbock broke in, triumphant at last to have something resembling accusation. "Where were you between, say, 8 and 9? Miss Grayle smiled then, and it was a smile without warmth. "In this room," she said. "Writing letters." "To whom?" asked Lubbock. "To my solicitor," she said, "and to the bishop's office. My brother had been unwise in certain arrangements. I intended to correct them." Vane gave a little sound, like a man choking on propriety. Whimsy's gaze drifted to the stopped mantel clock again, then to Miss Grayle's inkstand. The pen lay neatly beside a blotter. There were 2 sheets of paper, one half written. The ink on the top line looked dry. The ink on the lower line gleamed faintly as though still damp. Whimsy said lightly, "May I ask, do you habitually use lavender water to clean your hands after writing, or is that a new devotion?" Miss Grayle's face went very still. The housekeeper, rigid in the doorway like a sentry, said sharply, "Miss Grayle does not use scent, my lord." "No," said Whimsy softly. "I didn't think she did." He stepped closer to the writing table, not touching, merely looking. There, half hidden under the edge of the blotter, was a tiny thing, a sliver of glass, no longer than a fingernail, with a faint smear upon it that caught the light like dull silver. Whimsy looked up at Miss Grayle again. "Superintendent," he said conversationally, "if you wish to arrest someone, you may do so. But I should begin by searching this room for a broken ampule and by asking the housekeeper when she last polished that mantel clock. Because," and his voice, for all its lightness, had the quiet certainty of a trap closing. "Somebody in this house is very interested indeed in stopping time at 12 minutes past 7. The superintendent's men went over the morning room with that conscientious clumsiness which suggests they would rather be breaking up a drunken brawl than handling objects that might, in retrospect, decide a man's fate. A desk drawer was opened, paperweights lifted, the waste-basket examined with unnecessary solemnity. Miss Grayle sat perfectly still, hands folded, watching the proceedings with the remote contempt of a person who has been taught since childhood that servants are supposed to be invisible, even when they are constables. The housekeeper, Mrs. Durden, hovered near the door like a moral commentary. "I will not have that desk scratched," she announced. as though the wood were more vulnerable than the woman at it. Lubbock, who had begun to enjoy himself in the presence of something he could prod, said curtly, "You'll have what you're given, Mrs. Durden," she supplied, with the emphasis of a woman who has never allowed her name to be shortened without protest. "Durden. And if you interfere, you can go down to the station and polish our desks." Whimsy, meanwhile, had drifted, not toward Miss Grayle, nor toward the desk, but toward the mantel clock, the little stopped ornament that had somehow become, in his mind, the most indecent object in the room. He did not touch it. He did not even lean over it. He merely observed it with the absorbed patience of a man contemplating a beetle pinned to velvet. "You're quite sure," he said conversationally, "that it was going yesterday?" Mrs. Durden's spine stiffened. "It has always gone." "A touching faith," said Whimsy, "but clocks have a tendency to take advantage of it." He looked down at the hearthrug. Its pattern, twisting leaves in imitation of some woodland that had never been this tidy, was worn along one edge, where feet passed most often. Something else had worn it too, a faint, pale streak, as though a wet sole had slid, not walked, and left behind a trace of powder. Whimsy said softly, almost to himself, "Chalk or dried plaster?" Haskett, who had been peering into the wastebasket with an air of disgusted intimacy, straightened at that. "Plaster," he repeated. "From a cast, but she's not—" His eyes, involuntarily, went to Mrs. Durden's right foot. Mrs. Durden wore stout shoes, polished to the point of hostility. They revealed nothing. Lubbock, who's turning from the desk, said, "We've found a bit of glass in the blotter, like you said, and in the waste, look at this." He held up a small, crumpled square of tissue paper. On it, smeared in a faint, greasy arc, was a trace of something colorless that caught the light. Haskett took it, sniffed cautiously, and his expression altered. "Lavender," he said shortly. "Lavender water. Cheap." Mrs. Durden's chin lifted. "Miss Grayle does not use cheap scent." "No," said Whimsy. "She doesn't." His eyes stayed on Mrs. Durden. "But other people do, to cover other smells." Miss Grayle's composure cracked, not into hysteria, but into anger, controlled, cultivated, and therefore more dangerous. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You burst into my house, you paw at my belongings, and now you insinuate—" "What? That my brother was killed with lavender water?" "Not with lavender water," said Whimsy gently. "With something that lavender water would conveniently disguise. Something metallic. Something that leaves very little mark unless one knows where to look." Miss Grayle's eyes narrowed. "And you know," she said. "Of course you do. That is why my brother sent for you, is it? Because he admired your cleverness, or because he wished, even in death, to cause trouble?" Whimsy's smile was courteous and, in some obscure way, chilling. "I think," he said, "that Mr. Grayle wished to ensure that the truth did not become, shall we say, over-tidily arranged by local convenience." Lubbock slammed his notebook on the desk. "Convenience or not, we've got a woman's voice in the confessional, a lady of the house seen at church, and a dead man with a puncture like a needle. Miss Grayle, were you in that confessional this morning?" "I was not," she said. "Were you anywhere near it?" "No." "Did you speak to your brother in the church?" "I did not." Whimsy's gaze moved, with maddening irrelevance, to the amethyst brooch at her throat. "May I ask," he said, "whether that brooch is old?" Mrs. Durden drew breath to object, but Miss Grayle answered, clipped and proud, "It was my mother's." "A good stone," said Whimsy. "Amethyst is supposed to prevent intoxication, isn't it?" "The Greeks—" "I do not care what the Greeks supposed," snapped Miss Grayle. "Ah," said Whimsy, "but your brother appears to have cared very much what somebody supposed. Enough to come trembling to church and sit down to listen for a voice." There was a pause. Outside, the sea made its steady, An indifferent noise. The grandfather clock in the hall struck once. Solemn, accurate, like an old man clearing his throat before speaking truth. Whimsy said abruptly, "Mrs. Durden, when did you last go to St. Olave's?" Mrs. Durden blinked, affronted by being addressed as though she were a human being with habits. On Sunday," she said, "to hear Miss Grayle play." "And this morning?" "No. Never pop in early to check the flowers." Whimsy persisted, almost amiably. "Or to dust the altar, or to speak to the vicar about, church clocks." Mrs. Durden's mouth tightened. "I have duties here." "Indeed," said Whimsy, "such as winding clocks." "I wind the drawing-room clock," she said sharply. "Miss Grayle prefers it. She does not like the sound of the grandfather clock in the morning-room." Miss Grayle's fingers moved again, lightly, to her brooch, an unconscious gesture, like a person touching a rosary. Whimsy's eyes flickered to her hand. There was, he saw now, the faintest discoloration at the pad of her forefinger, an almost invisible stain. Ink, possibly. But ink did not usually smell of lavender. He said mildly, "Then perhaps you will tell me, Miss Grayle, if you dislike the sound of a clock, why is your mantel clock stopped at 12 minutes past 7, precisely the kind of time one might wish to establish as an alibi?" Lubbock leaned forward, triumphant again. "Aye, convenient that." Miss Grayle's voice came out low and razor-flat. "You are both vulgar," she said. "My brother is dead, and you speak of convenience. Do you think I cared for him enough to murder him? He ruined lives for sport." "That," said Whimsy softly, "us is the first honest motive I've heard all morning." Vane flinched, as though truth were profanity. Miss Grayle's eyes, suddenly bright, fixed on Whimsy with a hatred that was, oddly, tired. "He came to me last night," she said abruptly. "He said he was going to change his will again. He said he would see me beg. He said—" She stopped, swallowing. "He said there were things I had forgotten, that I was not who I thought I was." A silence fell that was not polite. Whimsy's tone did not change, but it deepened, like a voice moving into a lower register. "Ah," he said. "Now we approach the double life." Lubbock barked, "What things?" Miss Grayle's gaze slid away, to the window, to the grey line of sea, to anywhere but the faces in the room. "He said," she whispered, "that my mother was not my mother, and that if I did not do as he wished, he would make sure the whole town knew it." Mrs. Durden made a sound, half protest, half strangled alarm. "Miss Eleanor." Whimsy lifted a hand, silencing her as though she were a clock. "So," he said quietly, "Mr. Grayle held not only property, but identity in his hands. And this morning he went to church to confess. Perhaps not to God, but to someone behind a screen, someone who could speak without showing a face." He turned to Lubbock. "Superintendent," he said, "you may arrest Miss Grayle if you like. It will look splendid in the papers, but if you do, you will miss the more interesting question. Who else in this house knows the truth about Miss Grayle's birth? And who, therefore, had reason to keep Mr. Grayle from speaking?" Mrs. Durden's face had gone the color of old linen, and in that instant, as with the faint scrape of her right shoe upon the hearth-rug, Whimsy understood something else. Not merely that she limped, many people limped, but that her limp had the peculiar stiffness of a person who had once worn a plaster cast and never quite recovered the confidence of the joint. He looked at her very politely. "Mrs. Durden," he said, "did you ever, by any chance, work in a hospital?" Mrs. Durden's eyes did not move at once. She had the admirable self-command of the trained servant, of the woman who has spent her life in other people's rooms, receiving confidences she must not acknowledge and insults she must not feel. But something in the question, its mildness, its irrelevance, its terrible exactness, made her hesitate just long enough for everyone to notice that she could have lied more quickly. "A hospital," she repeated, and the word came out as though it had an aftertaste. "No, my lord." Whimsy's head inclined, as if accepting a perfectly reasonable answer about the weather. "How foolish of me," he said. "One associates lavender water with old-fashioned sick rooms, you see, and a certain deafness with small instruments." Lubbock made an impatient exhalation. "Lord Whimsy, if you've got something, say it. If you haven't, stop badgering women about their employment." "I should be the last to badger anybody," said Whimsy. "It is far too energetic an occupation. I merely inquire." Miss Grayle's voice cut in, cold and sudden. "Mrs. Durden has been with us since I was a child." "Then she knows a good deal," said Whimsy pleasantly, "and has very likely been paid to know it quietly." Mrs. Durden's lips whitened at the edges. She said, with controlled emphasis, "I know what is proper, my lord." "Splendid," said Whimsy. "Properness is such a comfort. It allows one to do almost anything so long as one does it in the right room." Lubbock, in the doorway between irritation and conviction, said, "We're here about a murder, not a sermon." "Quite," said Whimsy, and turned abruptly, away from the mantel clock and toward the window. The sea lay below like a sheet of beaten lead. A thin mist had come in, smudging the horizon so that the world looked unfinished. Along the cliff path, a single figure moved, small, bent, steady, making for the town with the patient gait of a man who has walked the same way too many times and knows there is nowhere else to go. Whimsy's tone altered, still light, but with the quiet directive force that, in him, took the place of authority. "Superintendent, who is that man?" Lubbock followed his gaze and grunted. "Swaffield. Old Mr. Swaffield. Bell ringer when he's sober, and he's sober as a judge these days. Poverty does that." "Fetch him," said Whimsy. Lubbock stared. "Fetch him? Why?" "Because he rang the bell," said Whimsy, "and because people who ring bells in small towns are like people who polish mirrors. They see everything and are expected to say nothing." Haskett, who had been watching Miss Grayle with a clinician's detached interest, said suddenly, "That limping, Mrs. Durden, it's not arthritis." Mrs. Durden's head snapped round, affronted by being diagnosed in her employer's drawing room. "I have never claimed it was," she said. Haskett's eyes narrowed. "No, you've claimed nothing at all, which is generally more revealing. It's a stiffness, old injury, a break, perhaps. Treated. Plaster." He nodded toward the faint powder streak by the hearthrug. "That chalk, if it's plaster dust, it can cling for years in a shoe seam, or it can appear fresh if you've been near it recently." Mrs. Durden's mouth opened, then shut again with a click like a clasp fastening. Whimsy turned back from the window and began, in his maddeningly casual way, to circle the room, never touching, always observing. His gaze fell upon a small work basket set beside a chair, needles, thread, a thimble, and, half hidden beneath a fold of linen, a little brown glass bottle without a label. "Ah," he said softly, and stooped, still not touching, to sniff. Lavender, unmistakably, and under it that faint penny tang. Mrs. Durden moved then, one swift step forward, too swift, too late. The constable nearest her lifted a hand instinctively, as though to block. "That is for polishing," she said too quickly. "For the brass." "Is it?" said Whimsy. "Brass? How domestic. One forgets how many murders have been committed in the name of housekeeping." Lubbock seized on the bottle as on a life raft. "Right, that'll do. We'll have that tested." Mrs. Durden's eyes flashed. Not fear now, but anger. "You've no right." "I have every right," said Lubbock, enjoying his own voice. "And if it turns out to be poison—" "It will not," said Mrs. Durden, and the certainty was like a slap. Whimsy, watching her, said gently, because you know what it is. Silence again. The grandfather clock struck. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked with the slow reluctance of old hinges. Miss Grayle spoke, and for the first time her voice carried something like genuine disturbance. "Mrs. Durden," she said. "What is happening?" Mrs. Durden did not look at her. "It is happening," she said, "because men do not know when to keep quiet." Whimsy's eyebrows lifted. "Men? Only men?" Mrs. Durden's throat worked. "Your brother," she said abruptly to Miss Grayle, still without meeting her eyes, "was going to ruin you. He was going to put it about, things that should never have been spoken. He was going to make you—" She stopped as though the word were too indecent. "And you sat here writing letters." Miss Grayle's face went very white. "You—" she began. "You knew." Mrs. Durden's mouth twisted, an expression that was almost, for an instant, grief. "I've known since before you could write your own name," she said. "I have kept it. I've kept all of it. And he came to me last night and said he was tired of keeping you. And he said he wanted payment." "Payment," repeated Whimsy softly. "And perhaps he wanted something else. A kind of power, a final taste of cruelty." Lubbock leaned in, breath loud. "So you admit motive?" Mrs. Durden turned her head then and looked directly at Lubbock with contempt. "Motive," she said. "Motive is what you call it when you want to make a neat story. I did what was necessary." "And where," said Whimsy, still gentle, "did you do it, Mrs. Durden?" Her eyes flicked, quick as a needle, to the window, to the sea, to the far-off church tower just visible through the mist. "I did not," she said, and her voice went flat again. "Miss Grayle went to church. She told you. She prayed. She always prays when she is frightened." Miss Grayle's hands clenched together hard enough to hurt. "I prayed," she said, and there was a fierce dignity in it. "Yes," Whimsy said softly. "And while you prayed, your housekeeper, who knows your secrets, wins your clocks, and has a limp that remembers plaster, went to church as well, not as a lady, not as a cleaner, but as something in between, a woman with business, carrying lavender water and a small, precise instrument." Mrs. Durden's breath hissed in. "I did not go." "You did," said Whimsy, and now, though his voice remained low, it had the quiet finality of a door being shut. "Because Mrs. Cramp heard a lady's voice, and Mrs. Cramp, being a sensible woman, assumes that any voice that sounds proper belongs to a lady. But you, Mrs. Durden, have spent your life hearing ladies. You have trained your vowels on theirs. You can say hush like a drawing room if it serves." Mrs. the Durden's face contorted, not into tears, but into a look of naked fatigue. "It was not meant," she began. "It was meant," said Whimsy. "It was meant to be confession, a curtain, a screen, 2 compartments, a man who would speak without being seen, and a woman who could answer without being recognized. You gave him what he deserved. Silence, permanently." Lubbock said harshly, "So you pricked him with a needle through the lattice?" Mrs. Durden's eyes shut for an instant, as though picturing it. Whimsy answered for her, quietly. "No, not through. The curtain was ajar. She went in behind him." "And the Times?" Haskett said suddenly. "The chapel clock." Whimsy nodded. "She needed uncertainty," he said. "If the clock cannot be trusted, no one can swear when she entered, when she left, when Grayle died. And back here." His gaze slid to the stopped mantel clock. "Someone stopped this one at 12 minutes past 7 to suggest an alternative narrative, that the household was already in a certain moment when the bell rang. A domestic lie to support an ecclesiastical one." Mrs. Durden's eyes opened. There was something like defiance in them still. "You can't prove it," she said. Whimsy's mouth curved, very slightly. "Oh, I think we can," he said. When Mr. Swaffield arrives, he will tell us exactly when the bell began, because bell ringers count, and then we shall see whether your clocks and your conscience agree." Outside, on the cliff path, old Swaffield was coming nearer, bent against the wind, bringing with him, perhaps, the one kind of testimony in Marlock that could not be polished into respectability, the measured and inexorable counting of time. Old Swaffield arrived with the wind in his whiskers and the expression of a man who has been dragged, against his will, into gentility. He removed his cap with stiff resentment, not at the company, but at the fact of being made to perform in front of it. His back was bent, but his eyes were sharp, the sort of eyes that have watched generations of other people grow old and foolish and have found the spectacle repetitive. "Mr. Swaffield," said Lubbock, "you rang the passing bell." "Aye," said Swaffield. "I rang it." "What time did it start?" Lubbock demanded. Swaffield looked at him with slow contempt. "Time?" he repeated. "You think I rings by time? I rings by count." Whimsy's head lifted a fraction, as though someone had spoken the correct line in a play. "By count," he said softly. "Excellent. And I'm fond of people who count. Go on, Mr. Swaffield." Swaffield shifted his feet, carefully. The old joints were not to be trusted, and spoke as if reciting something learned by heart. "I rung the first toll after 3 pulls to settle the rope. That's always. Then I rung 9 slow. Then I stopped and listened a bit, because the rope was catching like it does when the sea frets in. Then I rung 9 more." "9 and 9, said Haskett sharply. "Aye," said Swaffield. 18 altogether. That's how you do it for a man of Mr. Grail's standing. Not 12, not 24. 18, same as I done for his father." "And when did you start?" Lubbock persisted, helpless before arithmetic that refused to be translated into hours. Swaffield's eyes narrowed. "I started when I heard the vicar's boy running up the path. Edwin Pike, and he comes shouting like a gull. I says, 'Who's dead?' And he says, Mr. Grail. So I rung. Edwin, standing in the corner with the miserable eagerness of youth, blurted, 'I didn't shout, Mr. Swaffield. I only told you.' 'You made enough noise for a funeral and a fair,' growled Swaffield. Whimsy held up a hand as though soothing an orchestra. "Mr. Swaffield," he said, "how long does it take you to ring 18 tolls, properly slow as for the dead?" Swaffield considered. "Depends on the rope," he said grudgingly. "But 3 minutes to settle, and then call it a minute a toll if you're making it solemn. Half a minute if you're hurrying. I weren't hurrying." Whimsy's eyes glinted, faintly amused. "So," he said, "we have at least." He did not glance at a watch. He did not look at any clock. He merely counted. 18 minutes of bell, in plus stoppage, plus the boy's run from church to tower, which means, Superintendent, that whatever time you thought the bell began, your time, the chapel's time, the doctor's time, can be translated into a much more honest measure, sequence. Lubbock shifted, irritated. "Sequence doesn't put a murder on a man." "No," said Whimsy, "but it will put a lie out of doors." He turned, not to Miss Grail, whose face had become a mask of rigid distress, but to Mrs. Durden, who stood very straight, hands clasped, as though she had decided that if she must be condemned, she would at least be condemned in good posture. "Mrs. Durden," said Whimsy gently, "when Mr. Grail came to you last night and demanded payment, did he give you something, or did you take something from him?" Her lips parted, then shut again. For a moment, she looked like a woman about to speak truth and swallow it. "I've taken nothing," she said at last. Whimsy nodded as if accepting it, and in that nod was the quiet cruelty of a man who did not require her words. "Superintendent," he said, "may I see Mr. Grail's personal effects, whatever was found on him in the church?" Lubbock frowned. "They're at the station." "Then we should go," said Whimsy, "because there is something missing, and I should like to know whether it is missing by accident or by design." "What's missing?" demanded Lubbock. Whimsy's gaze slid back to Miss Grayle's writing table, its neat papers, its carefully arranged ink stand, and then to the stopped mantel clock. "A key," he said softly. "Or rather, 2 keys." Haskett stared. "Keys to what?" "To time," said Whimsy, and smiled at his own absurdity. "And to a drawer." He walked to the doorway, paused, and looked back at Miss Grayle. His tone, when he spoke to her, was still light, but there was something under it now, an odd, reluctant compassion. "Miss Grayle," he said, "your brother threatened to expose your birth. That is not a legal weapon. It is a psychological one. He intended to make you ashamed, and Mrs. Durden intended—" his eyes moved to the housekeeper— "to prevent that shame by any means at all." Miss Grayle's fingers tightened on her handkerchief until the fabric twisted. "You think she did it?" she whispered. "I think," said Whimsy, "that she did something. Whether it was murder, or whether it was only the last and most devoted act of concealment, we shall see. But your brother," and here his voice cooled again, "did not go to church to beg forgiveness. He went to bargain." Lubbock's impatience boiled over. Bargain with who? With her? With the vicar? With God? Whimsy turned his head slightly, as though listening again through the confessional lattice in memory. "With a voice," he said. A voice he could recognize even when he could not see the face. That is why the confessional mattered. And that is why Mrs. Cramp's evidence is so dangerous, because she heard what she was never meant to hear, and then politely mislabeled it as a lady. Mrs. Durden's breath came faster now. Her self-command, for all its iron, had begun to heat. "You can't make my voice into hers," she said suddenly, and gestured an involuntary flick toward Miss Grayle, then away again, as though ashamed of the loyalty even now. Whimsy's eyes narrowed with a kind of satisfied sadness. "Ah," he said, "so you were there." Lubbock sprang forward, but Whimsy held up a hand again, quick as a conductor. "No, Superintendent," he said. "Not yet. Arrest is a vulgar climax. Let us have the last act properly staged." He turned to Bunter. "Bunter, would you be so good as to call a cab? And also," his voice dropped, "ask Mrs. Tollaby whether she can produce the vicar's key ring. Vicars are always losing keys, and murderers are always borrowing them." Bunter inclined his head and went. Whimsy looked once more at the stopped mantel clock. It sat there, perfectly innocent, hands fixed in that little, smug gesture of certainty. "Do you see," he said quietly to Haskett, "how people love a stopped clock? It promises them that if they can freeze the hands, they can freeze consequences." Haskett, who was no philosopher but had seen enough bodies to distrust all consolations, said gruffly, "And you mean to unfreeze it?" "I mean," said Whimsy, "to wind it until it tells the truth." Outside, the sea continued to breathe. Inside, the grandfather clock counted off another minute, steady as a judge. And in the silence between its ticks, Mrs. Durden's restraint, at last, began to fray, thread by thread, like a curtain left carelessly ajar. Bunter returned with the vicar's key ring in a small cardboard box which had once held cough lozenges, and now held, with a kind of ironic propriety, the means by which other people's doors might be opened. Mrs. Tollaby, hovering behind him like a conscience in petticoats, announced that she had found them where they always are, meaning, by translation, that she had found them where the vicar had left them and then forgotten to look. "He drops them in the offertory plate," she added, with the grim relish of one who has long suspected that the church is run on absent-mindedness. "Like as if the Lord was to keep 'em safe for him." Whimsy took the box, weighed it lightly in his hand, and selected a key with the same delicate care he might have employed in choosing a cigar. "Excellent," he said. "Now we may all be pious burglars." Lubbock, who was growing tired of being made to feel slow in his own case, snapped, "What are we going back to the church for? We've got enough to hold Durden, motive, opportunity, bottle of lavender, glass." "You have," said Whimsy. "And if you are content with a pretty story in which the devoted servant murders the wicked master for the sake of her mistress's honor, then you may close your notebook, eat your luncheon, and congratulate yourself upon having solved human nature. But Mr. Grail wrote to me. He said his confession would not be believed. That implies," Whimsy's tone remained airy, but his eyes were intent, "that what he had to say implicated someone whom the village would rather not imagine behind a curtain." Miss Grail, still seated with her hands clenched about her handkerchief, said in a low voice, "You mean me?" "I mean," said Whimsy gently, "that your brother intended you to be suspected. He enjoyed arranging the stage so that the most respectable person in the room appears, briefly, the most depraved." Mrs. Durden made a sound, half contempt, and half a kind of weary despair. "He enjoyed nothing but cruelty," she said, "and he was going to do it again." Lubbock stepped forward. "You'll save that for the station," he said. "I'm taking you in." Whimsy lifted a hand. Not to forbid, he never forbade, but to delay, as one delays a piece of music until the right moment. "Superintendent," he said, "permit me 10 minutes, 10 honest minutes, measured not by St. Olave's clock, but by your own watch, which, though vulgar, at least does not pretend to sanctity." Lubbock hesitated. The desire to clap handcuffs on a tidy culprit fought with the uncomfortable sensation that Whimsy might be right. At last, he said grudgingly, 10, and then she comes. "Splendid," said Whimsy. "Bunter, will you accompany Mrs. Durden? She looks as though she might attempt martyrdom by staircase." "Mrs." And Durden's eyes flashed, but she allowed Bunter to take her arm, not because she needed support, but because Bunter's grip, courteous and firm, had the air of inevitability. They drove down to St. Olave's in a cab that smelt of damp horse and old upholstery. Whimsy sat opposite Miss Grail, who stared out of the window as if the sea might offer her a different past. Vane rode with them too, pale and silent, like an unwilling witness dragged back to the scene of his own incompetence. Lubbock, in the front, muttered occasionally to the driver as though words might speed the animal. The church, when they returned, seemed quieter, emptied out by gossip and officialdom. The constable at the chapel door straightened, relieved to have something to do. Whimsy went straight to the chapel clock. "Superintendent," he said, "your watch. As if you please." Lubbock pulled it out, scowling. Whimsy did not take it. He merely looked. "Now," he said, "we will set this clock." "Set it," barked Lubbock. "You can't." "Oh, but one can," said Whimsy. "One simply needs the key." He produced a small brass key from the vicar's ring and, with a movement so neat it was almost tender, opened the little glass door of the clock. Inside, the works looked like the inside of a moral argument. Wheels interlocking, springs under tension, all dependent upon a small central restraint. Whimsy did not wind it. He merely touched, once, lightly, the minute hand, moving it forward until it agreed with Lubbock's watch. At once, as though offended at being corrected, the clock ticked faster, then stumbled, then recovered. And in that stumble, as clear as a cough in a silent room, so came a second sound, the faintest scrape of something catching. Whimsy smiled. "There," he said. "That is why your times disagreed. This clock has been tampered with. Not broken, not merely inaccurate. Tampered with so that it hesitates and lurches, like a witness coached to forget and then remember." Haskett, leaning in, frowned. "What's catching?" Whimsy closed the door again. "Something small," he said. "A thread, a hair, a sliver of wax. Anything a careful person might introduce and remove again, to make a clock lie only when needed." Lubbock stared at the clock as though it had insulted him. "And what does that prove?" "That somebody wanted uncertainty," said Whimsy, "and that somebody had access to the chapel often enough to fiddle with it without being remarked." He turned deliberately toward Vane. "Mr. Vane," he said, "who has keys to this chapel, apart from yourself?" Vane blinked miserably. "The cleaner, Mrs. Cramp, Edwin, sometimes, and—" He hesitated. "And?" prompted Whimsy. "And Mrs. Durden," Vane admitted, and in his voice was the peculiar shame of the clergyman confronted by the fact that the wealthy do indeed have privileges. She has come at times to arrange flowers for Miss Grayle, and she has always been trusted." Mrs. Durden, standing with Bunter's hand still on her arm, did not deny it. She only lifted her chin. "I have never stolen," she said. "I am not accusing you of theft," said Whimsy, "only of access." He stepped into the confessional at last, into the priest's side, where Vane had never sat this morning and where someone else had. The little ledge still held the face-down prayer card. Whimsy lifted it. Aunt turned it over. On the back, in pencil, was a smear, an arc, as though a hand had steadied itself there. Beneath the smear, almost invisible, a few grains of white powder clung to the paper. Whimsy held it out to Haskett. "Plaster," said Haskett at once, "or chalk." Mrs. Durden's breath caught. Whimsy's voice remained mild. "Your limp," he said to her, "is not, as you say, a matter of theft. It is a matter of history. Hospital history, perhaps. A broken bone, a cast. The sort of injury one might acquire in nursing or in fleeing." Mrs. Durden's eyes shut for an instant, and when they opened again, there was something in them that had not been there before. Not defiance, but resignation, as though the last lock had clicked. Miss Grayle, standing very straight, said hoarsely, "Mrs. Durden, tell me the truth." Mrs. Durden's lips moved. No sound came. Then, very quietly, "He came to me this morning," she said. "Not last night. This morning. He sent a note by Edwin, told him to tell me to come. He said he would speak to me in church." Edwin made a small choking noise. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I thought it was about hymn books." Whimsy nodded, as though hymn books and blackmail were adjacent shelves. "And you went," said Whimsy. "Yes," said Mrs. Durden, "to stop him." "To kill him?" demanded Lubbock. Mrs. Durden's mouth twisted. "I did not go to kill," she said. "I went to bargain. Like him, he wanted me to say it, to say the words, to admit what I had done years ago, what I had hidden." "The double life," murmured Whimsy. "Not Miss Grayle's, yours." Mrs. Durden's hands clenched together until the knuckles showed. "I was her mother's maid," she said. "Not her housekeeper, her maid. And when Miss Grayle was born, when Eleanor was born, there was trouble. There was a child that could not remain. There was a name that could not be spoken. So I took her. I took her away for a time, and then I brought her back as—" Her voice faltered. "As his sister, as his burden, as his plaything." Vane made a sound like a prayer strangled. Miss Grayle's face went utterly white, as though all the blood in her had remembered another owner. "And he meant to tell," said Whimsy softly. "Not because it mattered legally, but because it would destroy you psychologically, and it would destroy Mrs. Durden utterly, because she would be revealed not merely as a servant, but as the architect of the deception." Mrs. Durden's eyes filled, not with tears that fell, but with a bright, furious wetness. "He made me go into that box," she said. "He said he would speak through the screen, like a priest, and I would answer like a penitent. He wanted to hear me say it. He wanted to hear me beg. He wanted me to say hush, as though I was still a maid, still taking orders." Whimsy's voice was almost gentle. "And did you say hush?" Mrs. Durden's mouth trembled. "I did," she whispered. "Because if I did not, he would shout it out in the nave. He would bring the whole town in on it." "And then?" said Whimsy. Her eyes flicked to the lattice. "He laughed," she said, quietly. "And he said, 'It's too late.'" Whimsy nodded once. "And then you pricked him." Mrs. Durden's shoulders sagged, an almost imperceptible collapse. "I had it," she said, "a little ampule, for myself once. I have lived with his voice in my head for 20 years. I thought, if he spoke, if he took her from herself, then there would be nothing left but the sea." Her voice broke then, but not into sobs, into something worse, a flat, exhausted honesty. "I did it," she said. "Not for money, not for spite, for silence, for mercy, and because—" she looked at last directly at Miss Grayle, "because I could not bear him owning you any longer." Lubbock stepped forward, almost relieved to have a confession he could handcuff. "That'll do," he said. "You're coming." Mrs. Durden did not resist. She only looked at the confessional, and her voice, when she spoke again, was small. "I told him it would damn me," she said, "and he said, 'My dear, you were damned when you did the first lie.'" Whimsy, standing in the little chapel with the lying clock ticking steadily again, said very quietly, "And that," he murmured, "that is why he sent for me. Not to save himself, but to ensure that in the end someone would believe the confession, because it was too ugly, too human, and too respectable to be believed otherwise." The cab took Mrs. Durden away with a kind of dreadful decency. She did not struggle. She did not appeal. She only gathered her shawl about her as if it were an apron and she were, after all, merely going out to do an errand. Lubbock went with her, full of purpose and the relief of a man who can at last file his villain neatly under a name. In the chapel, the air seemed to have altered. The confessional, robbed of its mystery, was once more only a wooden box with curtains, an absurdity suddenly, rather than an instrument. The clock ticked on with a new steadiness, as though, having been corrected, it intended to behave well for the rest of its life, and hoped that might be held in its favor. Vane sat down abruptly on a chair, his hands hanging between his knees. He looked not so much shocked as emptied, like a church after a funeral, when the flowers remain, but the meaning has gone. Miss Grayle stood very still near the altar rail. She had not wept. She looked rather as though weeping were a luxury that belonged to some other, simpler woman, and she had been required to surrender it along with the rest of her inheritance. Whimsy, who had been watching her with that detached attention which in him sometimes masqueraded as coldness, and was occasionally the nearest thing he allowed himself to tenderness, said at last, "It is always the domestic that undoes us, isn't it? Not the grand passions, not the high crimes, but the small, faithful habits, winding clocks, polishing brass, keeping secrets because it seems kinder than telling truths." Miss Grayle's fingers moved to her brooch again, not to display it, but to steady herself by the familiar pressure of metal against cloth. "She was my—" Her voice failed on the word, and she began again, more steadily. "She was my mother. In the only way that mattered," said Whimsy softly. Vane flinched as though the statement were a theological impropriety. "But, my lord, she killed a man." "She killed," said Whimsy, "a man who had been killing, by inches, for years. That does not excuse it. It only explains why it did not feel to her like murder. It felt like—" He hesitated, searching for a word that would not sentimentalize. "Like shutting a door." There was a silence, but the sea's breath came in faintly through the stone as if the world itself were eavesdropping, respectful now that the most indecent whisper had been spoken aloud. Miss Grayle said very quietly, "He sent for you." "Yes," said Whimsy, "because he was proud, even at the end. He wished his confession to be, what shall we call it, properly appreciated, and he also wished the consequences to fall where he directed." He smiled a little, without humor. It was his last arrangement. To make you suspect, to make Mrs. Durden damned, to make your vicar helpless, to make the village talk for a decade. One must admire the thoroughness. Vane put his face briefly in his hands. I should have known. I should have seen. He came. He asked. You were given, said Whimsy, exactly what he wished to give you, a role. The decent clergyman, hovering in the wings, forever 10 minutes late. Do not punish yourself for being cast. Vane looked up, eyes reddened. And you? He demanded, with sudden, bitter candor. What role were you cast in, Lord Peter? The clever man who arrives in time. Whimsy's expression altered, only slightly, but enough to suggest that behind the irony there was something not altogether comfortable. The clever man, he said lightly, is never in time. He is merely in time to explain. He moved toward the chapel door, and as he did so, his gaze fell with a kind of involuntary neatness upon the little ledge inside the confessional where the note had lain. The wood bore in the grain, the faint darkening where a hand had rested, Grail's hand, perhaps, or Mrs. Durden's, or both. It was a ridiculous thought, but it persisted, that confession leaves marks not on souls, but on varnish. Miss Grail spoke again. What happens to me? She asked. Whimsy paused. Bunter, standing a little behind, produced a handkerchief silently and offered it, not to Whimsy, but to Miss Grail, with the grave courtesy of a man who understood that class did not protect one from grief, only from its public display. Miss Grail took it, held it for a moment as if uncertain what such softness was for, and then said, They will know. They will know something, said Whimsy, but not, I think, everything. Superintendent Lubbock will have his charge. Murder. He does not, from what I have observed, relish the embroidery of birth and shame. The village will have its story, the wicked master and the faithful servant. They will prefer that. It requires less imagination. And you? She asked. Whimsy's eyes rested on her for a moment, steady, polite, and not quite kind. I, he said, shall go back to Mrs. Tollerby's and endure her opinions, which are a graver sentence than anything the law can impose. And then I shall leave Marlock St. Olave's to its sea and its bells and its excellent talent, for not mentioning what it has plainly seen. Vane rose unsteadily. My lord, what about... His voice dropped. About God? Whimsy's mouth twitched. My dear Mr. Vane, he said, God, like the police, has his own procedures. I do not recommend interfering in either, but if you wish my opinion, purely unofficial, it is this, that there is no confession more final than the one a person makes with a needle in her hand, and a lifetime of silence behind her. He picked up his hat, and the gesture, so neat, so ordinary, seemed suddenly indecent in that place. At the door he paused again and looked back, not at the altar, not at the vicar, but at the confessional and the clock. Do you know, he said, almost conversationally, the odd thing about time, people will do anything to alter it, stop it, hurry it, make it lie, because they cannot bear the one certainty it offers, that sooner or later one must pay for whatever one has borrowed from it. No one answered. The clock ticked, the sea breathed. Somewhere, faintly, the bell rope creaked as though settling itself after its labor. Whimsy went out into the nave. The winter light lay thinly across the stones, picking out every scuff and drag mark with indifferent honesty. At the west door, he turned his collar up against the wind and said, as though to himself, but quite audibly, Tempus edax rerum, time, the devourer of things. Though in this case, he added, with a little dry lift of the voice, it appears to have been assisted by lavender water and good intentions. And with that pedantic consolation, half Latin, half irony, Lord Peter Whimsy walked away from St. Olave's, leaving behind him a church that would never again sound quite innocent when it whispered. The cab had hardly clattered away with its burden before the church seemed to resume, with an almost indecent haste, its usual air of decency. A church can be extraordinarily practical. It is built to contain extremes, birth and death, vows and lies, and then to look between services, as though nothing of consequence has ever happened within its walls. Whimsy and Bunter walked back to Mrs. Tollerby's by the long way, and skirting the cliff path. The sea lay below, slate-colored and self-contained, and the wind came in little hard gusts that snatched at one's hat and one's thoughts with equal impertinence. "A bracing air," said Whimsy. "It has the merit of making one feel one has lungs, which in London is frequently an unproven hypothesis." Bunter, who had listened all day to confession of another sort, said, "Yes, my lord." They had nearly reached the churchyard when Vane caught up with them, his coat flapping and his face that peculiar grey-white of a man whose faith has been obliged to swallow more than its customary portion of human nature. "My lord, Lord Peter," Whimsy turned with resigned politeness. "Mr. Vane, I was hoping you would go home and drink something strengthening and then forget all about us in a spirit of Christian mercy." "I can't," said Vane simply. "Not yet. There is one thing." Whimsy's eyebrows rose. "Only one? You are doing well." Vane thrust out a hand. In it was a small object wrapped in paper. He held it as though it burned him. "They found this," he said hoarsely. When they took him away, it was in the confessional. Wedged here." He indicated with a shuddering gesture the place where the lattices met the frame, where a finger might hide a splinter or a secret. Whimsy took the packet and unwrapped it with neat fingers. Inside lay a key, plain, worn, the sort of key one forgets about until one needs it desperately. Bunter's eyes, trained to the private lives of locks, rested on it at once. "A drawer key, hard, my lord," he said quietly. "Quite," said Whimsy. He turned the key over and saw the faint stamp upon it. Not a maker's mark, but an initial A.G. Vane's voice scraped out, "He must have put it there. Before the needle," said Whimsy gently, "because it is sometimes kinder to use the ugly word than to let the imagination invent worse." "Yes." "And what does it mean?" Vane demanded with sudden angry despair. Was he still plotting, even then? Whimsy's gaze went to the church tower. The bell rope hung within, quiet now, like a muscle at rest. His tone, when he spoke, was light, but there was something beneath it that suggested fatigue. "It means," he said, "that Mr. Ambrose Grail desired an epilogue, and he could not bear to die without leaving a final little parcel of malice to be opened after his departure." Vane stared at him. "You mean he wanted more harm?" "I mean," said Whimsy, "that he wanted control. Harm is merely the method by which certain temperaments express it." They walked on in silence a few yards, the key in Whimsy's palm making a small, definite pressure, like the point of a question one cannot avoid. At Mrs. Tollerby's, the landlady met them in the passage, aproned, vigilant, and faintly offended by the world's refusal to remain respectable. "There you are," she said, "and police in and out all day, as if my house was an inn for criminals. There's tea if you want it, and mind you don't bring that church damp upstairs." "Tea," said Whimsy with a grateful sigh, "is the only sacrament I recognize without argument." In the front parlour, he sat down at the table as though it were a desk in chambers. He placed the key upon the cloth with an exaggerated care, making of it, by the very precision of the gesture, an accusation. "Now," he said, "we must decide what drawer Mr. Grail wished to open for us from beyond the grave." Bunter had already produced a small notebook. Bunter's memory, when externalized, took the form of perfectly ruled lines. "Grail House, he said, has at least 3 writing rooms, my lord. Mr. Grayle's study, the morning room desk, and a small business desk in the library. Mrs. Durden holds keys to most cupboards. Mr. Grayle kept the study key himself. Did, said Whimsy. Past tense. How quickly the grammar obeys death. He picked up the key again. Emerson looked at it as if expecting it to speak. It is too late, he murmured. Yes, too late for him to enjoy the reaction, but not too late to arrange for it. Vane, who had been standing by the window, said with sudden, bleak intensity, "Will you go back? To Grayle House?" Whimsy glanced up. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight the town will be alive with the intoxication of explanation. People will be kind to Miss Grayle. They will pity her. They will condemn Mrs. Durden. They will congratulate themselves upon knowing exactly what sort of woman commits exactly what sort of crime. That is their evening's entertainment." "And you?" Vane asked. Whimsy's mouth twisted. "I shall sit here," he said, "and consider whether Mr. Grayle's last cruelty was aimed at the living or at the dead." He drew the note from his pocket, the one that had begun it, and read again the few lines, particularly the phrase that had seemed merely melodramatic in the first shock. "I've made a final confession, and it will not be believed." He knew, said Whimsy slowly. He knew that a confession like Mrs. Durden's would be believed at once. Everybody likes believing that a servant can be driven to violence. It flatters their sense of order. But a confession that would not be believed. He paused, and his eyes sharpened. That would be something else. Bunter said quietly, "A confession by Mr. Grayle himself, my lord." "Possibly," said Whimsy. "Or a confession that implicates someone the village will not imagine as guilty, because it is too inconvenient, too subtle, too polite." Vane's hands clenched on the back of a chair. "Then Mrs. Durden may have told the truth," said Whimsy, "and yet not the whole truth. She is devoted. Devoted people lie for love with a purity that would make ordinary liars blush." There was a long pause. Outside in the street someone laughed, too loudly, too brightly, the laugh of a person repeating news for the 5th time and enjoying the sensation it produces. Whimsy, suddenly restless, stood up and began to pace, not quickly, but with that precise impatience of a mind that has discovered a seam and cannot leave it unpicked. "The key," he said. "Why hide it in the confessional? Why not in his pocket? Unless he expected it to be taken." "Taken?" Vane echoed. "Yes," said Whimsy. "If Mrs. Durden searched him, she might take a key from his pocket. But if he wedged it into the confessional frame, it would remain, until found by someone else. Until found by the vicar. Until found by me. It is theatrical, it is—" He stopped, and his gaze went to the mantel clock in the parlour. Mrs. Tollerby's clock was not handsome. It was the sort of clock one buys because it was cheap and because time in lodgings is expected to be practical. It ticked honestly, without lurch or hesitation. "Bunter," he said softly, "what did Mrs. Durden say precisely about the ampule?" "That she had it," said Bunter, "for herself once." "And Mr. Grayle," said Whimsy. "Did anyone examine his hands, his pockets? Did he have anything else, anything like a bottle or a syringe case or a second note?" Bunter's eyes met his. "No syringe case was reported, my lord, but Superintendent Lubbock did mention Mr. Grayle's cigarette case being unusually empty." Whimsy's pacing resumed, one turn and another, until it was almost a ritual. "Empty," he murmured. "A man like Grayle does not go about empty. He goes about equipped." Vane said desperately, "What are you suggesting?" Whimsy stopped and looked at him, and for a moment the ironic mask slipped just enough to show the hard intelligence beneath, and something like weariness. "I'm suggesting," he said, "that Mr. Ambrose Grayle did not go to confession merely to confess. He went to ensure that a particular person would come to him behind that curtain. and he went with something in his possession, something he could threaten to use, or to give, or to destroy. He lifted the key again, letting it glint in the lamplight like a small accusation. "And this," he said, "is the address of that something." Bunter, who had been waiting with perfect patience for his lordship's mind to finish arranging itself, said, "Shall I have the car ready at first light, my lord?" Whimsy's smile returned, thin, dry, and very English. "At first light," he agreed. "We will go back to Grail House. We will unlock whatever Mr. Grail could not bear to take into the grave with him, and then—" He paused, as though choosing between humor and honesty, and settling, as usual, for humor. "Then we will discover whether the dead, like the living, can be relied upon to tell the truth when they have nothing left to lose." He placed the key carefully into his cigarette case, snapping it shut with a little click that sounded in the quiet parlor, uncomfortably like the final fastening of a lock. Upstairs, Mrs. Tollerby's floorboards creaked as she moved about with purposeful indignation, laying out clean towels and wondering what it all came to. Down below, the clock ticked, honest and indifferent, and beyond the town, St. Olave's bell, at last at rest, waited to be rung again for someone else, at some other hour that would, in its turn, be declared too late.